think we've seen the future state of work. Most of us believe the world won't go backwards. So how do we adapt to the challenge of building distributed teams in this new reality? In this session, you'll learn how to adapt and discover engineering talent in a distributed world. So let me introduce you to our speakers. We have Laura Thompson. She's the VP of Engineering at Fastly, where she leads the platform engineering team. She's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Internet Society. Previously, she spent more than a decade at Mozilla leading engineering and operations teams and was on the board of Let's Encrypt. We have Han Wan. He's the founder of Post PC Labs LLC, building cash flow break-even projects with product market fit. Before Post PC Labs, Han was SVP of engineering at Upwork, leading 350 plus engineers in over 40 different countries. Han's incubated world-class teams for places like eBay and Netflix. And then we have Daniel Dargam. He's the president and CEO of Logica. He brings over 25 years of international experience in a diversified range of software engineering, marketing, sales, and general management experience for both established and high-growth companies. Prior to Logica, he held several engineering and management roles at KLA, Tencor, and IBM. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining. There we are.
Hi.
Hello.
Hey. Great to see you all. For everybody listening in, as you can tell, this panel has a huge breadth of experience, and we have spoken before and identified 4 core strategies that we wanted to explore together, ranging from the approach direct recruiting platforms, agencies, and acqui-hires as different general paths to find talent. Everybody here has expertise and deep experience navigating multiple of these strategies. And so we have a lot of really interesting and exciting stories to dig into here. So to start off with this exploration, I wanted to kick off with probably the first approach that comes to most people's mind, which is the direct recruiting strategy. And so, Laura, I was wondering if we could open up this question for you. Can you give us a quick breakdown of the direct recruiting strategy and some of the advantages or disadvantages that you've seen or encountered directly at Fastly or from your time at Mozilla?
Cool. Thanks, Patrick. I think the most obvious advantage of being able to directly recruit anywhere in the world is that you can hire the best people wherever they are. And at Mozilla and also at Fastly, we have taken the approach of seeking out people who are involved in standards work or, are famous for the open source work that they've done or other tech work that they've done. And it's really nice not to be constrained to, say the Bay Area and competing with everybody else with the same talent. So that has been like a huge advantage in the past. Disadvantages, I think one of the things that is hard if you are starting to hire like individual people, if they're the first person in a location or first person in a time zone, because it can be difficult to be that person, right? To be a sort of a team of one, if the rest of the team is, particularly if they're different time zone located rather than geographically located, which is not that big a deal. So.
Thank you, Laura. Han, Daniel, I wanted to open up the advantage and disadvantage conversation to both of you as well, because I think both of your perspectives have seen different companies face different challenges and have come to you for different types of solutions. And so I guess, Han, to start off, what are some of the advantages or disadvantages that you've seen with like the direct approach for recruiting remotely?
In certain cases, like if you actually use a platform, let's say Upwork or Fiverr, they sort of help you with the discoverability, right? Instead of actually networking around the world, you have a more e-commerce-like experience. So I think in that sense, these kinds of platforms help you with the match. But the challenges of actually recruiting individuals, like Laura had suggested, they still exist. You still have to vet them. And typically, if they are remote, your approaches for vetting them are going to be very different, right? Your approaches for doing an in-person interview are going to be radically different than if you were to do an interview on a video conference. And the kinds of things that you might want to test for, in addition to the technical piece, the soft skills, may also be dramatically different. So I think some of the challenges that Laura was alluding to definitely exist, even if you use a platform to help you with the match.
Thank you, Han. So for the direct recruiting approach, Daniel, is there anything that you observed both in the recruiting that you've done in building your own teams, but also with what you've observed with different companies that you've worked with, some of the advantages or disadvantages that you've encountered also?
You're not referring to direct recruiting. You actually meant with the agency model, right?
I would like to talk about the agency model in a second. I was wondering if you had any observations.
Yeah. So direct recruiting is, has the advantage of giving you direct control, right? Because you really see one-on-one, and you establish more of a direct employer-employee relationship. Now, the disadvantages, I would think, are mostly around the ability to scale. And so if you're hiring each individual at a time, you can't scale as fast. And then you might want to wonder how you can keep the teams together in the same location, because one day we hopefully will be back working together in the same offices, or at least nearby, where we can meet in person as convenient. So I think that's really how I think about it. It's scale versus control, and then the equation becomes a lot more complex if you're looking at geographies outside the U.S., because then you get into considerations such as labor laws, legal, even understanding the cultures. And so those are other dimensions that I can get to later.
Absolutely. I think we definitely want to dive into those in a moment. But one of the points that you brought up, Daniel, was scale versus control and navigating that. And I think that's something that every engineering leader bumps into as they're navigating recruiting. And I know, Laura, you had mentioned in a previous conversation some of your past experiences at Mozilla building out the teams and some of the challenges that you're running into at Fastly. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about like that scale versus control consideration and some of the strategies that you found effective addressing that challenge.
So I think in general, you're talking about sort of scale versus control, particularly in recruiting, right? Distributed teams. I think that one of the things that is hard if you are recruiting at any scale, it is really hard to keep the quality up and keep the culture up, because I think part of the job of an engineering leader is to grow and progress and, grow your culture into something healthy and a place where people want to work and can be productive. And when you grow very fast, it can be easy to lose that. So there's kind of even when you're trying to grow quickly, there's sort of a certain amount of curation in terms of figuring out how to keep things moving along. You can reach a point where if you're sort of hiring too fast or spending too much of your time on hiring, you really end up thrashing so hard that you don't get actually that much work done. And that's a huge problem.
Thank you. I think so. In highlighting this, like the takeaways I have around like disadvantages of direct recruiting that we've talked about so far, we have like the talent is everywhere, but the vetting is the challenge, or like the quality and the culture can be the big challenge. And so I think that those are interesting ones to call out. And I think as we explore some of the other different strategies for recruiting, I think we'll find different ways that some of those other strategies can compensate for some of those challenges. So I'm definitely interested in that. I'd like to transition to Han, because at Upwork, you built the platform that helps people hire globally. And for you yourself, also then hired a global team. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the platform strategy and some of the advantages or disadvantages or ways that people have leveraged that to grow teams globally.
Well, one of the things that I think not a lot of people know about Upwork is the company actually dog foods the platform. So about 2/3 of the engineers are actually hired off of the platform. About 1/3 of the engineering team is actually based in the Bay Area. At the time, our recruiting strategy was to really focus on regional folks that had deep expertise in certain areas that were otherwise very difficult to hire. For example, high scale architecture expertise, microservices, things like that you're more likely to see at a larger company like a Facebook or a Google. Payment expertise. We had many people who ex PayPal. Those are going to be a little bit difficult to find at a global scale. But in terms of sort of, and this is not to be meant as an offense, but more off-the-shelf skills like Vue.js or HTML or JavaScript, where you can get excellent engineers that have more generic skills. We definitely hired them off of the platform. One of the key pieces of that is that has to be an intentional strategy on how you do that. And so then everything is built around that, like your hiring practices. You need to train your staff on what we do to vet. Everything needs to be a little bit more asynchronous. We had folks in 40 countries around the world, virtually every time zone. And so not everything is necessarily real time. And of course, by virtue of it being a distributed team, that there's sort of a presumption, of course, that the organization itself had a distributed team culture. So there's some flexibility in terms of being able to operate rail to rail, evening and morning, to be able to accommodate things like interviews and things like that.
I think you brought up some really interesting questions, Han. Like when you were talking about the strategy of establishing regional expertise as a way to build out, hiring pipelines. It made me think of, I think like Daniel, you've been working with global teams, and Lohika provides global teams for different people. I was wondering if you could answer the question of like, how do you establish regional expertise? Like, what have you observed for somebody to like different pathways to do that? Because I imagine like so right now I'm in North Idaho. I want to recruit a team from all over the world, but I have no idea how to begin to establish regional expertise. Do you have any insights, Daniel, on what you've observed or stories from your own experience that have helped with that?
Sure. So there are some characterizations, and I do want to start by saying that I think it's dangerous to characterize expertise by where people come from or where they live. But we have seen on a global scale some general things that many of our clients iterate back to us. Some of our clients have their own teams in different geographies, so they speak out of firsthand experience. And so what I found, the former Soviet Union, the ex-Soviet bloc, whether it's Central Eastern Europe, tend to have more of the math skills, just because of the past that they had with heavy focus in higher education that the Soviet Union was driving with nuclear and space and defense, those kinds of fields. So all those folks are really good at more engineering type of a mindset, I would say, as opposed to a computer programmer mindset. India is certainly the go-to destination where there's really large scale of computer programmers. But what we found is that the deep expertise in the more modern technologies seems to be sometimes a bit more difficult to find there. And so that's the expertise side. I don't know if you want me to get into the culture side or not. That's a whole other topic. You only asked about expertise, but I'd be happy to expand on cultural differences as well, because I think actually that's really predominantly what is the biggest difference in hiring individually, whether it's through a platform or through individual recruiting versus working with a third party, is there are cultural differences that are, I think, really significant. And when you hire through a platform or direct recruiting and you mix people from different cultures because they come from different countries and different backgrounds, I think the picture gets way more complicated when it comes to making sure you have some uniformity in the teams that you're building.
I think that's an interesting point to raise. I'd like to open it up. Han, Laura, do you have any comments you want to add to this particular topic about establishing expertise?
Yeah, actually, I want to pick up on something that Daniel said. I think this is the classic diverse team thing, right? Which is that when you have folks from really different backgrounds or really different cultures, then sometimes it takes longer to get to a decision or consensus, but you generate much more creative solutions, right? Because of the sort of the interactions between the different perspectives that folks have. And I find that incredibly valuable. But I think it's sort of a macrocosm of the things that you might see in your own team as you're sort of embracing more diversity in engineering teams.
Thank you, Laura. Han, do you have any follow-up comments?
In certain cases, I'd actually be curious what Laura thought about this, because I probably defer to the expert here. But there are certain things, like especially in the open source framework world, where you'll see certain regions like they just tend to have a little bit more enthusiasm for a framework. Like, for example, Ruby on Rails. There was a lot of talent, probably still is, in South America. And I think that's where, kind of understanding the space on where the skills might be at global scale, either framework expertise or language expertise or just general skills. I think that there are pockets of that. And I think some of that is, in a lot of cases, I think is just driven by the community itself. And so when you have a sort of more open mindset around recruiting, I think it opens up some different possibilities.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true, both with, I think, standards communities and open source communities, that there tend to be sort of geographic clusters of folks that are interested in it. You know, often it's where the thing originated. So I think like Ruby also has like a pretty big Japanese community for that reason. So yeah, it's great if you can take advantage of that, right, and build on it. And also one of the things when you're building a distributed group of folks, as I said, it's helpful if you have a few folks in the same time zone or culturally the same, because I think it, you know, helps them to feel like they're not the only one or not completely isolated. So definitely if you can build on existing communities, then it's incredibly helpful to bootstrap distributed teams.
Great, thank you, Laura. So we have one more strategy to explore, and then I wanted to talk more broadly about the discovery process and how to leverage those different approaches to help people find talent faster, because that seems to be the common theme that I'm seeing in the chat come up is like, well, how do I do this faster? How do I make this easy? And so Daniel, I wanted to turn to you because, you know, at Lohika and your expertise is oftentimes providing some of the high growth companies with access to world-class teams so they don't have to hire engineers individually. And so I was wondering if you could help us understand a little bit about some of the scenarios that people should consider going with an agency or a partnership route, and to share some of the advantages or disadvantages with that approach.
No, absolutely. So I think it's commonly known that there's a sort of bias that if you go and work with teams offshore, it's really because the labor costs are lower, and therefore you got to save on your engineering costs. And so I think what people haven't really thought enough about in the past is the fact that there's a huge imbalance between supply and demand of talent in other geographies, sort of the opposite of what we see, for example, in the Bay Area. So you have a plethora of talent and engineering talent that's really looking for opportunities to work in countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, which is where we have most of our engineers are in Ukraine. However, you don't have captives like, you know, Microsoft and Google and Facebook are not going there and opening big engineering centers. Therefore, you have that talent that's available and that, frankly, is highly motivated to work on advanced product development, working for many of the companies that are probably listening us to our panel today. And so if you have an established provider such as ourselves that's been in country for now 20 years, has an established reputation and brand name, knows where to find the talent, knows how to attract the talent, you know, do the right level of screening, can bring the folks in-house and then build these teams over time and develop their careers. You have a distinct advantage in accessing unique talent that nobody else really has access to. And then the challenge becomes, of course, how do you organize the team so that they work well with your clients remotely? Now, why would somebody not want to do that themselves directly? So it takes a lot of time and energy to go and set up a remote operation. And then there are a lot of complexities and unique things around, like I said, labor laws, how to get people just paid even, quite simply, but how do you pay somebody when you don't have a proper subsidiary set up? There are legal risks, there's IP risks. So there are a whole bunch of things that is not worth going through if you are going to build a team of 20, 30, 50 engineers. The economies of scale are not there. So I think that's the great advantage of working with a partner that's already established in the country. They have proven expertise, they have years and years of doing this, and they sort of alleviate the risks. They give you the ability to scale, and you can, of course, reference check. So instead of individually screening individuals through either recruiting or through a platform, you can actually go and reference check the provider. Now, of course, you lack that control. So even though you might work with a great provider, it doesn't mean that every single individual that they put on that team for you are as good as you would expect them to be. But over time, if the provider has established a great reputation, and if you're very clear on what you're looking for, I think it's a really great recipe, as long as you need to scale that. That's really sort of my point. Is it's not worth it if you just need a few engineers. But if you need to scale, you actually have a competitive advantage over others if you work with the right partner that has access to that unique talent.
Absolutely. And I think you brought up a really interesting point. It reminds me, we had a quick conversation yesterday when you were talking about the verification and like assessment of talent. And I think one of the things I wanted to open up to Laura was like from talent assessment standpoint, like if you're working with people you've never met before from all different parts of the world, there's a little bit of like the concern that, one, how do they fit the culture? Like how do you fit like our organization's culture? And then two, can they do what they say they do? And Laura, you mentioned a really interesting like approach to this. I was wondering if you could share how you've thought about that in your strategy with talent discovery right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's two questions in there. I'm going to take the first one first, which was, how do you check for culture fit? I think a friend of mine framed this to me really usefully the other day, which was when you are interviewing people, it's not about how they fit your culture, but how will they help your culture progress, right? What do they add that you didn't have before, which is a really nice way of thinking about it. The second part of your question, how do you vet folks? I think, as I said, a lot of the individual recruiting direct stuff that we have done has been based on, here's a person that we know that has a specific set of talents. Right, this person has a blog or they've written an open, let's say they work on a language or a framework that you're already using, right? And of course, that's huge if you have somebody that's like the author of the tools that you're using come help work with you. So you know them by their work. And then a lot of what you're doing is verifying that they have the soft skills that you'll actually be able to work with, right? Like, do you have people skills? You might be a brilliant coder, and we can see that because we can look at all your code on GitHub or whatever, but can you actually work with other people, which is sometimes harder to measure. It is a little easier interviewing folks over Zoom, say, when you're going to be working with them on Zoom. But it is sometimes hard to get some of that extra context and cues that you would get from a face-to-face job interview.
Thank you. Han, do you have any insight on approaches to vetting different people, assessing candidates from like a remote context?
I think when it comes to, hiring and recruiting, I think every people manager has their own sort of little tips and tricks. I would only say that in the distributed context, I, look for all those other things. But one of the things that I put extra emphasis on is whether or not the candidate, and this is going to sound a little bit meta, but whether or not the candidate is able to, how good are they at learning? Do they know how to learn how to learn? And the reason is because you are going to be a little bit abstracted from the parent organization potentially, or where some of the decisions are made. And so how scrappy is this person in terms of picking things up very quickly, getting up to speed under potentially very challenging circumstances? And I think that's actually one of the very critical skills that you may not need to be as adroit in if you were, just working in the same office. The second thing that I think is actually very important is to figure out whether or not the individual has good written communication. And by that, I don't mean, how advanced is their, English vocabulary. That is not necessarily what I mean. What I'm looking for typically is how clear are they in expressing their needs and expressing the issues that they're facing. And so embedded in that implies things like word choice, right? Like, I'm struggling on this project versus I have a problem in this file, in this module, on this line of code, and I need a solution by this date or from this team. And very different skill. And figuring out ways to vet out how people communicate, especially written form, is important, just because so much of distributed development is asynchronous. And so I do think some effort needs to be taken in terms of understanding how people communicate in a written way.
I absolutely agree with everything you just said, by the way. It's huge, especially for the asynchronous nature. Also, people who can document what they do, who can describe and sell a technical vision, especially if they're senior or like a principal engineer, if they can write something compelling, it's actually super important in a way that it wouldn't be nearly as important in an office. I will say that I think one of the interesting differences there is it is an environment that allows introverts to excel. People who might not be so good as getting up in front of a meeting and sort of, expressing what they think we should do, or, what the solution to a technical problem is, sometimes very good at writing it down. So it's a slightly different set of skills.
Thank you. So I appreciate all three of you helping like break down the advantages and disadvantages with these different strategies, because I think it helps people understand the trade-offs and like the appropriateness of when you should do one versus the other. And so I'd like to, we had a question come in from the chat from Vamshi Bupalan about how should smaller companies who maybe don't have, the same unlimited resources that like a larger company would have, hire fast but not compromise on quality? So I kind of look at this as a case study, right? Like, so we can take like the smaller company who needs to hire fast. And I was wondering if we could close with, what is the first step that you would recommend for them to hire fast but not compromise on scale? And if you had, like a next step in an approach, but also if you had like something that you've observed in your past experience that you could share that like backs up that principle, I think that would be really illuminating for the folks dialing in. And so I would like to open it up to Daniel first. Could you what would be your here's your next step in your strategy if you are a fast growing company who needs to grow but doesn't want to compromise on quality, and what have you seen worked?
Sure, absolutely. I think hands down, if you want to move really fast, you have to work with a partner and the right partner. And it's not that the partner can hire faster than you, that's a given, but the right partners, certainly ourselves, actually have a bench available, right? And so what happens when you have a bench of engineers available, ready to go, is literally you can deploy the next day. So our typical turnaround time from the moment we get a request to the moment we have a team in place is about 1 to 2 days. What that does, not only do you move fast, but it actually lowers the risk significantly because you're getting a set of individuals that are already employed by the partner. So there's a lot less risk there because they're known entities to the partner, but also they've most likely worked together before as a team using the same tools and processes, and they already have a well-known set of established processes in place that they've used working with distributed teams before. So that for me is hands down the best way to go, hit the ground running extremely quickly. And so we've seen clients move from nothing to 30, 40 engineers with us within typically 3 to 4 months. And so that for me is without a doubt the number one thing if you want to move really fast.
Thank you, Daniel. Han, what would be your next step? Company's growing fast. What have you seen? What have you seen work in helping expedite that strategy and ensure quality?
I think there are probably a couple dimensions to it. So one dimension that I would add is more of a question, which is how much work are you willing to do, in general, as the company? And then the second piece that I think is sort of a more open question is how much ownership would you like to have in terms of, or have the folks have when they're working with you? So on the first piece, if you want to be involved in the process, I do think there is an opportunity for direct hire. If you don't want to do the legwork, you can use platforms like a Fiverr or an Upwork to assist you with the match. The one sort of trick that I would say in terms of how do you build these teams fast is to have a very open mind in terms of hiring fast, but also, and this is going to bother some folks, but you have to be very good at firing fast. So make sure that you have the processes in place to be able to put in the provisions, to be able to bring people on board, vet them, and make it very clear how you're going to cut them loose if they don't perform. Because you're probably not going to be great at hiring initially, but if you can recover from your mistakes, I think you can build a team fairly fast. Now, if you don't want to do the legwork, I agree with Daniel, go with an agency, go with a provider. My tips there would be, number one, make sure that you vet your technical lead very, very carefully. That individual, your day-to-day point of contact, sets the tone for that entire group. I would also negotiate with any of these providers this idea of a shadow resource. So if I am provisioning a 10 or 15 person team, I would want to know how many people that I'm not getting billed for, you're going to be training in the background so that if there is churn on the team, I have a replaceable asset very, very quickly. In terms of ownership, I think you're going to need to have a strategy, right? So even if you use a provider, are those folks going to, come to bat for you? What is that company's culture? So understanding your provider's culture and how they communicate your needs, your desires, and whether or not they will take on your problem as if that is theirs. Assessing that I think is really important. You don't have to solve that problem as much, when you're doing direct hire because the relationship is more direct, but there's also more work. And I think ownership is important because you want folks, regardless of the exact business relationship, to do good quality work. And when things don't go well, to really help you resolve it.
Thank you so much, Han. Laura, bring us home. What is that next step? The first step that you would send? High growth company, what have you seen work for that next step?
So the thing I want to emphasize is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? So the best way to move fast is to make sure you have a strategy and a process and build a pipeline, right? If you do things in an organized, systematic way, it will be faster. The second part of that is don't be afraid that you're not moving fast enough, because I think, as Han says, right, if you hire the wrong person, it can be really expensive. And even if you fire fast, especially in some other countries, some of the labor laws, you can't fire people fast. It's going to take a really long time. So be okay with taking a little bit longer to get the right person, because that person will accelerate you. So that's my takeaway.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Daniel, Han, Laura, thank you three so much for sharing your expertise. I think for me, it was so powerful to see the different approaches that you could take and where things move faster, where things can be more effective, where engineers can be more effective in how they choose their approach. And so thank you three for sharing and spending the time with us and helping people discover talent across the globe, which is, I think, this is the reality that we're all facing now, is that talent is everywhere and there's a lot of different ways to find it. And there's a couple ways to do that really effectively. And so thank you three for sharing that expertise with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.